thank you everyone for joining us tonight on quite a dark and chilly night for quite a dark and chilly sounding event, Orwell's Final Warning. We're delighted to have David, Sandra and Jeff here to unpack, well, what was Orwell's Final Warning? We may move beyond that at some point in the conversation quite quickly, but
I think we'll move beyond it immediately, quite frankly.
I think it was said before that maybe we can see it. We don't need to know, but that at least is our frame for this evening, is Orwell's Final Warning. And today is, of course, 75 years ago to the day since Orwell died. Not that far away from here, indeed a few hundred metres away in University College Hospital. So I'm just going to introduce the panel each in turn, and David very generously has agreed to chair tonight's proceedings. The only other thing for me to say is please do buy a book. Books will be for sale after the event. There'll be someone with a card reader probably just there. And also, if you enjoyed tonight's event and you want to help us put on more events like this and support everything the Foundation does to promote Orwell's legacy, and indeed to come to more events like this, then please consider joining us as a friend as well. And it's great to see so many friends here. So Sandra Newman is the author of Julia, the companion novel to 1984. I think I'm allowed to say brilliant companion novel to 1984, told from the perspective of Julia. She's also the author of 4 previous novels, including The Heavens, and several works of non-fiction, including a memoir, Changeling. Jeffrey Wasserstrom is the Chancellor's Professor of History at UC Irvine. He's the author of Vigil, The Struggle for Hong Kong, you can see behind you, and the Milk Tea Alliance Inside Asia's Struggle Against Autocracy. He is working, and I'm allowed to say this, on a book about Orwell in Asia, which will be out
couple years.
Yeah.
Depends how good the questions are.
But we're very excited about it. And DJ Taylor is a writer and critic, the author of 12 novels, numerous non-fiction books. His first biography of Orwell, The Life, won the Whitbread Biography Prize in 2003. Following the discovery of new letters, he released a second biography, Orwell, The New Life, which you can see behind me. And his guide to Orwell and his novels, Who is Big Brother, was published last year. So I can't think of a better panel to consider Orwell's Final Warning. And without further ado, David.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Is this on? Is this microphone actually working? Yeah, good. Okay, splendid. The acoustics are pretty good here anyway, I think. It's, as Jeremy said, it's great that so many of you have turned out on this filthy night. As I was standing outside looking at my phone, the temperature actually dropped a degree as I was looking at it. It's that bad. And as I was standing there doing this, I noticed, of course, we're in Gordon Square. Now, Gordon Square 100 years ago was known as High Bloomsbury. It was where the absolute, the absolute upper strata of the Bloomsbury group hung out. And I was thinking to myself how little Orwell really cared for the Bloomsbury group, and how ironic in some ways this juxtaposition of us and them was this evening. Just to fill you in, as Jeremy has adumbrated, Orwell died 75 years ago in the early hours of this morning when an artery burst in his tuberculosis-scarred lungs. A sad irony in that he had actually, well, he not recovered from his TB, but the TB had burnt itself out. It's just he had a form of TB where the arteries became exposed, and he could have gone off at any moment. The last 3 months of his life in University College Hospital were an interesting, for many reasons. He got married to his second wife, Sonia, in October 1949, and according to the friends who visited him in the months following, it cheered him up no end. He was reinvigorated, and he sat up in bed wearing a scarlet smoking jacket that he bought to be married in, because he was so ill he couldn't leave his room and had to be married by Archbishop of Canterbury's special license. He couldn't even attend the wedding breakfast, which all his friends marched on. And it cheered him up, and he was reinvigorated. And his friend Anthony Powell said that it brought out a kind of Woodhouseian side in him. And he sat in bed looking greatly cheered by this. And then when I was working on The New Life, I discovered a letter written by Cyril Connolly's girlfriend, Lise Lubbock, dated on the 11th of November 1949, which just has the word, "Poor George has had a relapse." And that was it. And he lived another 10 weeks. And all terribly sad that the fishing rods which had been brought for the trip that he was supposedly going to pay to a sanatorium in the Swiss Alps lay there in the corner of his room. And he died on the morning of the 21st January 1950. Since that time, a great deal has been written about him, a great deal has been projected about him. And we're talking to you about Orwell's final warning, which really is a bit of a red herring because there are all sorts of warnings, and I'm sure that in 50 years' time, another highly select panel will be sitting here talking about, how those warnings worked out. Because he always said that 1984 was not a prophecy, but the late Peter Davison, the great scholar who edited the 20 volumes of his collected works, actually once went through it with a fine-tooth comb and made a little table of all the things Orwell had got right. And there were so many of them, I think it ran to a couple of paragraphs. But I think one of the things that interests me, quite apart from, the current political international situation, and another terrific irony is that the Orwell Foundation spent a lot of its time trying to refute inaccurate tweets about Orwell that Elon Musk posts on X. Poor old Gene Seaton is always, sending me emails saying, "Did he really say that?" And I'm going, "I don't think so, Gene. Let's put it through the search engine." And no, it's Elon just causing fun. So there's that aspect of it. But I suppose one of the things that fascinates me, and I immediately want to ask my panelists about, and could I start actually by recommending Julia, which is a brilliant novel, really great piece of work here, and also Jeff's piece in Prospect this month which contains some fascinating speculations about what would have happened, what would we think about it, well, had he died early, or rather even earlier than the pitiful 46 years that he made. But the projections of Orwell that continue to be made are, to me, one of the most fascinating things about him. And I want to start by asking Sandra, who's written a projection of 1984 herself, where she thinks this is going and why she thinks it's so fertile in the current political and aesthetic climate that so many people are bent on this particular fact.
Okay, thank you, David. Thanks so much, especially for the pitch for the book, of course. So, projections of Orwell. So I should say, I think this is a sort of an interesting backstory to my own book, is that I was asked to write it by the Orwell estate, not to be confused with the Orwell Foundation. So the Orwell estate, which is essentially the literary agent, Bill Hamilton, who represents the estate of George Orwell. And he's been like a very serious and, notoriously strict custodian of this intellectual property. So he decided to, I not commission this book because I was not paid, but to ask me to write this book. And I have to say, Gene Seaton has said, so I respect her opinion on this, that she has said that he wanted to do this because he has daughters and he felt that there was a feminist issue in Orwell's work that had to be addressed. But there is another side to it, which is that people had been approaching him for years wanting to write this book, the book that I wrote. So a book that is 1984 from the point of view of Julia. And he had always said no, just fearing what might result, or perhaps not trusting the individual who asked him. And then 1984 was coming out of copyright. So he could no longer say no and trust that it would stick. And so he went to find somebody to write the book so that he could prevent other people from profiting from it. And I think that, one of the things that really, especially in our times, is most important about it is that 1984 is intellectual property, and it's very valuable intellectual property. That's why Bill Hamilton was so careful about it, because he was trying to prevent people from cashing in cheap ways. And even when Elon Musk is tweeting out random things and claiming that Orwell said them, that's a form of wanting to capitalize on the authority, on the power of Orwell, and trying to get a message to go farther and be taken more seriously. And you can do that by using this intellectual property. So in a sense, I was given this opportunity, which is like being given a lot of money, even before you sold the book, to use the authority of Orwell. And I'm, very, really kind of deeply moved that Bill trusted me to do that. anyway, so I feel like I've gone a long way into like a very small aspect of what you asked.
Well, what I was just going to ask you, because we talked about this in the preamble, is that and you mentioned that the kind of the number of supplicants. I mean, the Orwell estate in the person of Bilhampton spends its time, or certainly before most of the copyrights went 4 years ago, spent its time simply repudiating people. And there was a famous, back in the 1970s, I'm beginning to think that it was apocryphal, that people used to say there had been a famous meeting in 1973 between Sonia Orwell, the widow Orwell, and she very much behaved with the gravitas she thought appropriate to the role, and David Bowie, who wanted to make a musical out of 1984. And that, I think, would have been one of the most bizarre meetings you could imagine. Bowie and his clan, this is the Ziggy Stardust era, and Sonia. And in fact, the residue, she told him no. And the residue, there are several songs he'd already written that appear on the Diamond Dogs album in 1974. So we can see how Bowie's mind was working. But you were talking, Sandra, about your experience of what we'll call the Orwell fan fictioners. Could you tell us a little bit about those? What do they write about?
Okay, so one thing that Bill could not stop people from doing is writing fan fiction. Well, he could theoretically, but it would be extremely expensive and difficult. So he really has not attempted to do this as far as I know. So on fan fiction sites where people are just writing, usually it's a 2-page long thing, which is just a teenager's imaginary engagement with a work that they love. And there's a great beauty in them. Like, they're almost all filthy, for one thing. So they almost all involve a sex scene, even within the 2 pages. And the sex scenes are usually homoerotic. So it's usually they're pairing Winston with O'Brien. And sometimes they're pairing Winston's wife, Catherine, with Julia as well. That's a common pairing. But another common pairing is to pair Winston Smith with Guy Montag from Fahrenheit 451. So that's a common one. There was even a one, and they do really odd things. And this was a beautiful one, which is a series where Guy Montag and Winston Smith ended up living together in an IKEA and being in love. And I don't know why it was an IKEA.
So this is the kind of state that Orwell studies is reaching. So that's fascinating. And I think at the same time that your own novel was published, Adam Biles wrote a projection of Animal Farm, which kind of adapted it for the modern world and had various parallels with COVID and lockdowns and all that. So it's obviously, to pluck a phrase from French structural criticism, it's a kind of universal signifier in some ways, isn't it? Or a floating signifier, do they call it? But one of the things that struck me, and I'd like to bring Jeff in here, because there's this area of specialisation. I mean, one of the things that anybody engaged in the study of Orwell's reputation, his posthumous reputation, is the kind of way, certainly from the very early 1950s onwards, in which he was expropriated for uses with which he would not possibly have been very pleased. And he foresaw this. Some of the saddest letters that he ever wrote towards the end of his life to friends in America saying, I know this book is going to be picked up and used as a stick by the right to beat the left, but there's nothing I can do about it, and really sooner that its message shouldn't get out at all. And we know that the CIA immediately picked it up, weaponized it, to use that modern word, underwrote Hollywood films of 1984, used Animal Farm for propaganda purposes. And looking at the current international situation where the paradigms are shifting, and whereas in the immediately following Orwell's death, the great struggle was between both sides of the Atlantic. It was a transatlantic political struggle as the former free republics of Eastern Europe started falling down to Soviet oppression. But increasingly, the tectonic plates are shifting towards the east, and I know Jeff's working on a book about Orwell and Asia. And I'm just wondering what you think about projections of Orwell in that direction, because I remember a Burmese friend of mine once telling me that in Burma, Myanmar I should say now, they think that Orwell wrote a trilogy. And the first book was Burmese Days, and the second book was Animal Farm, and the third was 1984, which is not a projection, a pattern that people in the West would necessarily think. So I'm thinking to myself that on the other edge of the world, there is a completely different view of this, and some completely different projections of that 75-year dead Orwell.
Great. Yeah, it's a real honor to be part of this discussion. And I love that idea of the trilogy. And it's also talked about in Emma Larkin's Finding George Orwell in Burma, which is the best book that's been written about Orwell connecting with Asia. There's also another good book, Orwell and Empire, that came out recently that looks at the way Asia figures in, or how Douglas Kerr, no, you're here, how Orwell thought about empire, thought about Asia, was influenced by his time in Asia. In that idea of a trilogy, the idea is that Burmese Days was about Burma as it was under colonialism. And the most interesting thing to me is, and 1984 was, he was a prophet because he knew what the darkness that Myanmar would experience. But I'm really interested in the Animal Farm part of it. Animal Farm is seen as what happened after colonialism, when you had a shift, and this is a different way of reading Animal Farm that it shows up in some other parts of the world, other than the West, where it's often thought of in terms of the Russian Revolution. Animal Farm is about how you replace the people in control by peoples from a different species. When colonialism ends, you replace the people in control with people of a different race or ethnicity, and sometimes the same forms of oppression continue in the same way that things continue in Animal Farm, even after the revolution. So you might think that if Orwell had died younger, going to that idea from Prospect, if you were reading Animal Farm as a warning of the future, you would say, watch out for people who lead a revolution and then become like the people they displaced. And that is the book that's for sale here of mine is about Hong Kong, and it's called Vigil, and the roots of it began in me observing the umbrella movement in Hong Kong in 2014, which was in a place that had been under British colonial rule, and then the period of colonial rule had ended, and one of the exciting things was that there would be Chinese people in charge of Hong Kong. Instead of a colonial governor appointed by London, there would be somebody who was ethnically Chinese. But the students at least thought that what had happened was the chief executive was somebody who was taking orders from Beijing. So things hadn't changed so much because you still had somebody governing locally who was doing what Orwell would have called the dirty work of empire in another context and forming suppression. So when students were protesting in Hong Kong in 2014, they used an Orwellian quote, but even though they were being threatened for absorption into the People's Republic of China, which we often think of here, a big brother state, they weren't drawing on 1984, they were drawing on Animal Farm. They were using the quote, all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. And they also organized a reading group to talk about Animal Farm. So there is that kind of connection there. And it's not just Asia. There is a novelist, I need to find out more about this, somebody who's translating Animal Farm into different languages used in Zimbabwe, to think about the way in which there too you had a sense in which the chill is about having an end to colonialism, but still having similar forms of oppression continue. So I think that's one example of the projection. I'll give one other example of how things go differently, specifically about China. The word Orwellian now, often the first thing that comes to mind is surveillance and control. But in an earlier period, that was one thing that came to mind, but another thing that was often very focused on was the 2 minutes of hate and the idea of rituals of denunciation. When 1984 was allowed to be translated into Chinese, first for a select group and then published widely, around the year 1985, when people in China read that, at least some of them thought, we don't have the 2 minutes of hate anymore. That was rituals in the Cultural Revolution. So they thought of 1984 as being about a stage that their country had moved out of, whereas now often China is thought of as having moved into 1984.
fascinating. So, again, a completely different perspective on the standard kind of Western view of. We're talking about warnings, prophecies, whatever. I was just thinking of this, and I think this is something you mentioned in your prospect article, Jeff, is that in this over the summer, Radio 4 conducted what I thought was a very imaginative piece of programming. They had a whole weekend, and in fact, over the following week, series of programs on the theme Orwell versus Kafka. And the title of that was perhaps unnecessarily adversarial because there was no real conflict between Orwell and Kafka. In fact, the ways in which they mutually complemented each other were rather remarkable. But the fascinating thing, I suppose, was how the series arose, the kind of kindling spark for this. And it came some years ago, actually, when Ian Hislop's Private Eye was one of, after Computer Weekly, I think Private Eye was the first magazine to break that story about the sub-postmasters. And Ian Hislop interviewed Sir, as he now is, Alan Bates, about his ordeal and said, what you went through there, would you describe it as Orwellian and Kafka or Kafkaesque? And Bates said, well, that's a very interesting question, because he said, yes, now I think of it, the kind of bureaucratic obfuscation and wire pulling that we had to deal with, that was Kafkaesque. But the denial of objective truth, that was really Orwellian. And so the two things kind of came together. And when we, I suppose if there are numberless themes to 1984. If you kind of poke beneath the surfaces, you come across all kinds of stuff. Orwell, for example, prophesied the advent of a national lottery. It was one of the subtexts of one of the things that the proles are kind of seduced by. But it's surveillance technology, and it's the denial of objective truth. And it's the use of language to obfuscate and actually deny people the ability to think. I mean, the point of Newspeak is it reduces the word pool rather than expanding it. So it actually restricts your ability to formulate thought. That's one of the really terrifying things. And yet, interesting, as Jeff was just saying, if Chinese people sometimes regard 1984 as a stage through which the country has moved, there is a way you can read. Certainly the conclusion of the appendix to 1984 is showing a more positive side, in that the appendix about Newspeak seems to be written from a historical perspective, suggesting this is past and that we've come out the other side. But I suppose what I wanted to ask both of you now is where you think we are in those debates about language, where you think we are in those debates about surveillance technology. Where you think this is, I remember 20 years ago when the first of my Orwell books was published saying, you can't pick up the op-ed column of the newspaper without reading an essay about Orwell and his relevance. And the same is more or less true now. How do you think this is going to play out? Will we in 20 years' time be sitting here having these conversations, do you think? In terms of prescience and relatability?
It's interesting. I wonder if we won't be so immersed in an Orwellian world, particularly in terms of surveillance, that it will be hard to explain to people that there was a time before universal surveillance, that there was a time when there was such a thing as privacy, and when there was such a thing as the reliability of information. I think I'm always, I think about this far too much, obviously, since I wrote my novel, but with AI, there's the possibility that you could be speaking to someone on the phone 10, 15 years from now, and your words would be changed as they came out of your mouth, and they would not know any different. So I do wonder if we're not heading towards a world in which Orwell will seem so superseded by what has actually happened that it will be quaint.
It's a terrifying thought. Jeff, what do you think?
Well, I guess one of the things would be maybe there'll be a different element of 1984 that again comes to the fore, because I had an experience teaching 1984 to some students in Ukraine via Zoom in something called the Flying University for students in Ukraine. And I tried out this idea of the sort of fundamental thing that Orwell was initially inspired by was hatred of empire. And some of the other things came later. And that resonated very clearly with them, with the idea that one of the ways you can think about Putin's moves into Ukraine is restoring an empire. Another way can be to think of Putin as a big brother leader in a different way. But they saw some things in that. So you can talk, and yet you could also think that the key other thing that probably was in that list of things he got right, the idea of three blocks that move in different ways. So maybe you could imagine a time where now there's a lot of, China versus America, or East versus West. Maybe there'll become a time when I hate to make Cambridge, when Brazil is a very big thing. Although I have a Brazilian historian colleague who said the saying about Brazil is the future and it always will be. It never quite gets there. But if there were India, we could think maybe he would be thought of as not very interesting for surveillance, but interesting in his geopolitics. Sorry. But I wanted to know, is there any Orwell Kafka fan fiction where they're the couple?
There must be.
No, but I didn't get. I have to say I didn't get to some of the best ones. And I just like my personal favorite is the one where it's basically 1984. The scenario, O'Brien is interrogating Winston, but then very fortunately Oceania is attacked by Godzilla. So this has nothing to do with what we're talking about, but
well, I think in a way it does. You see. I mean, we're talking about appropriations and people using Orwell for their own ends. And I'm party pre, of course. I'm saying not the biographer. I'm a biographer. There have been many Orwell biographers who came at him from different points of vantage. But to bring it back for a moment to Orwell himself, on whom I'd like to get your perspectives. One of the things I've noticed in 25 years writing and thinking about Orwell, and that's that's discounting all the times when I was thinking about it before I started writing books about him. One of the things that struck me is what we'll call the particularization of Orwell. And what I mean by this is that when I started work in the late 1990s, there was a thing called Orwell Studies. And Orwell Studies wasn't a very grand affair, and the people interested in Orwell Studies could probably have been fitted into this lecture theatre, I would have thought, without any undue trouble. 25 years later, there's a thing called the Orwell industry. And for the generalist, for the synthesist, such as myself, all this is terrifying because you realise that it's well known that Orwell's life falls into some rather neatly demarcated compartments. There's Eton, there's the prep school, there's Eton, there's the Burma police, and so on and so forth. And you discover that every compartment on which you set your eyes has got 3 or 4 specialists working deedily away. And I'm sitting here thinking, that's Douglas Kerr sitting in the front row. He knows far more about certain aspects of Orwell's life than I do, as do you. This is scary, you see. And so the particularization means that it's very difficult. It's become much more difficult to generalize about Orwell, and there are particular interest groups who are taking a serious interest in him. One of which, for example, is the Me Too movement, which you would expect. And women writing about Orwell is a good thing, because for many years, for half a century, it was basically a boys' club. On the other hand, when polemicists get to work on matters of biographical fact, there are times that the biographer sits there and thinks to himself or herself, this is just plain wrong. This is using evidence in slantidicular ways to prove political points. And as a woman who has written about Orwell, I'd like to know what you think about that and where.
What do I think about that? I think we're kind of drifting into talking about Anna Funder. That's my.
Well, you can if you like.
Yeah. But I think she is sort of the, I don't know, the figurehead of this movement, at least at the moment. And I've done a number of events with her because our books were coming out at the same time in various countries. And I found her really fascinating. She's extremely glamorous. She has bushels of blonde hair, which she actually does this. Which I kind of love her for. I love people who are unlike me in these ways. And she is, I like her. I have to say that. I like her, and I really, I think in some ways she's a misunderstood figure because she understood herself as writing a novel.
Really?
Yes, but when it was received as a piece of nonfiction, she was willing to take that too.
You see, it's in the
Yeah.
biography section in Scholz.
Yeah.
It's now a biography.
Yeah, and she has. I was at a festival where she began to talk about Orwell and say things that were, it was like you're sitting there crossing your eyes, and it actually made like the Daily Mail and everything. It was when she sort of famously said that he was a sadist, he was homosexual, he was misogynist, and like this long list of pejoratives. And then she would say, but of course I love his novels. I love his nonfiction. I love his work. I'm a great fan of his work. So there's what I guess I think about it is that again I love to digress. And I've digressed onto this because I find it really interesting. But to actually answer the question I was asked, what I think about it is that there is a tendency to jump from hearing someone say negative things about George Orwell to thinking, well, this means that all of his works are tainted, and if you read them, there's something wrong with you, and all of his work is somehow intellectually bankrupt, which is not, I think, even the intention of Anna Funder when she's saying those things. And I'm not sure if I've encountered anyone who means that. I'm sure there must be that person somewhere out there who thinks that George Orwell should no longer be read.
I imagine there probably is, yeah. I mean, the thing is that, as ever, in any sort of form of public or intellectual debate, the great icons, there are sections of people, for whatever reasons, from whatever political or ideological groups, who are there to give icons a kicking, who are anxious to find out discreditable things about famous people from the past, so they can give them a good going over. And usually, not always, but usually their motives turn out to be slightly questionable. I mean, I remember back in 2002 when Orwell's list was finally revealed in all its complexity. Now, for those of you not au fait with this was the list of supposed communist fellow travellers that Orwell supplied to a branch of the Foreign Office in 1949. His friend Celia Kerwin, who was then in charge of this, and its sole purpose was to identify left-wingers who were not suitable to write pro-democracy pamphlets for distribution in Eastern Europe, then falling under Soviet domination, because they weren't actually Democrats. And so the kind of people that Orwell put on this list were Labour MPs who, quote, who were actually secretly members of the Communist Party and taking their orders from King Street, the Communist Party of Great Britain headquarters. And when this list was published, and there are some quite bizarre people on it, whom Orwell clearly didn't like and was having an opportunity. I think it's Charlie Chaplin on it, I think, and J.B. Priestley, people like this. You think, actually, no, that's probably going a bit far. But a lot of those people were very suspect in ideological terms. And just to give you an idea of the kind of levels of duplicity that were going on, this story was told to me by Bernard Crick, Orwell's first biographer. And Bernard Crick, in the late 1940s, was a friend of the sister of Ian Mercado, the prominent left-wing Labour MP, who later became chairman of the Labour Party, huge figure. And Miss Mercado once said to Bernard Crick, of course, she said, Mick's got two cards. Now, what that meant, he had a Labour Party membership card and a Communist Party membership card, but nobody on the Labour front bench ever found out about the Communists. So that was the kind of atmosphere in which all this was being conducted. But as I say, when the list was published, several people immediately jumped, I always knew there was something suspect about Orwell. I always knew there was something wrong here. And in fact, one of the people who made this accusation was the distinct, very elderly he was, then Marxist historian Christopher Hill, then in his late 90s, who jumped up to say, I always knew there was something suspect about that chap. And if you look back, you found that in 1938, Orwell had written an absolutely damning review of some book that Hill had written. But anyway, I just wondered what you thought about that, Jeff, in terms of the constituencies that are now interested in Orwell.
Yeah, and I mean, there are people who don't think you should read Orwell. I happened to have a coffee before this with somebody from Belarus who works in Belarus, and it's 1984 is banned there again. Mm-hmm. Whereas one of the things when places stopped being part of the Soviet Union was then you could read 1984. But so there clearly are dictators who don't want to read, won't want people to read Orwell. But I wanted to bring up something about women here, because I was struck when you mentioned Fahrenheit 451, that's something that was thought of as actually a kind of pastiche, actually, of Orwell and Huxley, I think, in a lot of ways. But now the main book that I think of as going along with 1984 was one that was started to be written presumably in 1984, because it came out in 1985, is The Handmaid's Tale.
Mm-hmm.
And it's Margaret Atwood is clearly bringing gender centrally into, patriarchy centrally into the story, but she's also very clear about how much 1984 is an inspiration, down to the point of ending the book with what she identifies as a hopeful ending in the spirit of the appendix from Newspeak. Only that time, I think in that it's an academic conference looking back at the era that is now thankfully over. So there are different ways in which there can be, I think there's been a flourishing of writing about Orwell by women, and Margaret Atwood also has written about Orwell, and Rebecca Solnit's Orwell's Roses. So it's actually been quite an interesting moment now.
Thanks very much. And so we sit here at a time when books about Orwell seem to be falling like leaves from trees. He must be one of the most written about, both commercially and in academic terms. There are academic books being published about Orwell. There are fiction books being published which are projections of Orwell. And it's remarkable. I suppose one gets asked this in America a lot. One gets asked, in terms of standing and international reputation and historical reputation. And I think you would have to say that, if you're going to sort of erect a pantheon of great British writers over the centuries, then it's basically Chaucer, Shakespeare, Dickens, Orwell. That's how it goes. The interesting thing, I suppose, and this takes us back to 75 years ago this week, in that the funeral was held on the 26th, 5 days after he died. And on the afternoon of the funeral, Malcolm Muggeridge, his great friend, who spent a great deal of time with him towards the end of his life, Muggeridge went back to his house and spread out all the obituaries that had appeared in the papers over the previous 4 days on the desk in front of him, and read them all, and then wrote in his diary that having read them, he could see how the legend of a man had been created. And that's one of the extraordinary things, because, and I'm not being flippant by saying this, but in terms of his reputation, Orwell died at exactly the right time. He died young of an awful disease, having just, in sort of emotional circumstances, having just got married. But he died at the time when, the Western world was pivoting politically. I mean, Winston Churchill devised the phrase, the Iron Curtain, at the speech in Fulton, Missouri in 1947. But Orwell, I think it's true to say, devised the phrase, the Cold War. So, the man who has somehow managed to set his stamp on contemporary historical circumstances then dies the moment he's done it. And most, the legends, the myths, I suppose, that surround most iconic figures take some years to accrete. With Orwell, it happens in 3 days. And, within a few weeks of his death, symposia are being prepared on his... I can't think of a comparable figure who by dying created that sort of sensation. And I suppose the question I want to ask next of you is, how do you think, if such a panel as this is convened in 50 years' time, how the panelists be thinking of him then?
Well, I guess. Sorry, as an American, I'm feeling very negative about the future at this precise moment. So I'm going to be the one who says all of these really depressing things. I hope Jeff won't mind me taking that role.
As long as you don't want me to disagree with you. Yeah.
Oh yeah, it would be great if you disagreed with me, actually.
I just realised I'm in the minority here. Of course, I'm flanked by two American panelists. Okay.
So I feel like if we can still talk about Orwell in 50 years' time, that would be great. I do have a certain fear that we might be going the way of Belarus in these respects. And it's hard to, I find it so difficult to project that far into the future now, that it's, And sorry, I'm getting distracted because I actually brought something in my pocket that I could read that's so off topic that it's really almost begins to feel as if I'm trying to break the rules. But
Rules are there to be broken. What have you got?
what I've got
A list.
A list.
It
Well,
is
no,
a
a
list.
list.
It's a list of enemies. No, it's something that I just read that I thought I would write down. It's something that is kind of an artifact of a time when things couldn't be talked about. It's from 17th century China, as it happens. So a writer called Jin Shengtang. I do not speak Chinese at all, so please forgive me. And he's just talking about meeting with friends and how like he has 6 to 7 friends who come to his house every single day and they drink together and talk. And he says, our talks do not relate to the royal court. We do this not only because we are law-abiding, but because there are lots of rumors due to the long distance between the royal court and where we live. As those rumors are not real, talking about them is a waste of our breath. So it's sort of like a way of thinking about a world in which talking about politics is pointless because you can't know anything about politics and it's against the law. And yet he's still meeting beneath the trees with his friends and drinking wine. And it's a happy reflection about how wonderful they are for not wasting their time on this sort of thing. And he is a wonderful writer. You can't dislike him. You can't feel, oh, this is a terrible dystopian world in which this person is living. So it was a bit, I guess, because I'm in that stage of grasping at straws politically, that I sort of clung to it. Bringing it back to Orwell. So worst case scenario, I think rather than it being a panel, it would be a group of friends under the trees who do talk about the royal court and who still have copies of these books and still discuss them. And it's still something that can plant a seed for the future.
That's a consoling thought, Sandra. I suppose the point I would make, which is connected to that, is that what I always tell to young people who ask for a steer on this great writer, and the thing I always say is that the magnitude of his work, 21 volumes now it is, and probably some extra bits too discovered since, of essays, journalism, letters, the novels, and it's an enormous bran tub into which repeated dips bring up anything but bran. You get a prize every time. And so the most outwardly trivial piece of journalism, those book reviews that he wrote during the war, straight onto the typewriter with the bombs falling outside and bits, they are wonderful. There's not a book review that he wrote that hasn't got some sentence, that hasn't got some thought. And in fact, one of the reasons I value Orwell is not actually for 1984 and Animal Farm, but for all those wonderful essays he wrote in Tribune about obscure writers that no one's ever heard of, but you went and read them and they were brilliant. I would never have discovered George Gissing without Orwell. I'd have never discovered Tobias Smollett. I would have, half a dozen people who are kind of, enmeshed in my cerebral cortex. They're there because Orwell put them there. And I'm sure a lot of people find this. The other point I just make before I get Jeff's view on this is another thing we should remember here, 75 years after his death, is that our link with him, that personal link with him, is going. There are only 7 people left in the world. Richard Blair and I, Orwell's son, sat down not long ago and tried to count the number of people we knew who knew him, by which I mean could remember him, rather than people who were in their prams, over which he bent in 1946. And it's 7. And the youngest of them is Richard himself, who's in his 81st year. So another 10 years, we're very lucky if there's anyone left in the world who remembers of him. So he's disappearing from our actual, our proper sort of collective memory. There's that aspect. But anyway, Jeff, you...
I wanted to mention just one thing when you mentioned dying at the right time. There's a lovely thing that David wrote about how his obsession with Orwell, it was like when you're young and there's a band that you hear that just seems to speak to you. And for me, musical analogies are always on my mind. And I think there are some musicians who they died at the right time in a kind of progression of music, that they have an outsized ability to say, if they had lived longer, they would have done this, they would have seen it. But I also was just struck thinking about America and thinking forward and thinking of that way of finding a kind of hope within, kind of dystopian period we're going into. This is the first event, obviously, that I've done thinking about these kinds of things after the Trump inauguration, and I was reminded that the first public event I went to after Trump's first election was a library event reading by Emily St. John Mandel about Station 11. And Station 11 is another thing to add to this. It's about, and I haven't seen the dramatization of it on television because I love the book so much. I'm sort of worried about it. But in that, it's about a kind of a post-apocalyptic setting in which people still find ways to care about things in different ways. It actually resonated with the passage you read. However dark it gets, you have to find something to focus on. And I've been spending a lot of time with talking to young activists in East Asia, in and from East Asia and Southeast Asia. And the dystopian work that matters the most to them isn't Orwell, for many of them. It's actually the Hunger Games, which is a case of a, spoiler alert, if anybody doesn't know how it ends, close your ears. It's young people who face a authoritarian state, a big brother state, and they rise up and they win. So it gives you a kind of hopeful, so you can see why people who are fighting against incredibly difficult odds might seize upon that as the thing to look forward to.
Thank you. The final thing I was going to ask you about, I'm not going to actually ask you because it's such a dim question. It's so speculative. It's the old one about, well, had he lived, what would he have done? It's just, which is futile. He was a writer who died in 1950. We can't say anything about what he might have written or what his views on, the miners' strike or the Falklands War would have been. The only point, which people have done, there have been learned. I've read several pieces saying, oh yes, he'd been very, very keen on Brexit. And I'm thinking, what? Having written that article toward European unity in 1947, I think not. But I suppose the only point I would leave you with on that before we have some questions is that I think it can be said with certitude that had he lived, he would not have carried on down the dystopian line because, as you all doubtless know, in the 1930s he wrote 4 very old-fashioned in tone, realistic sort of English novels, although one of them is set in Burma, but it's a very English novel. It's saturated in essence of Somerset Maugham, amongst other things, and other writers at that time. But when he died, he'd written just a few pages, a few notes of a novella, which was to be called A Smoking Room Story, and it's set in 1927 on the boat back from Burma. And it looks actually as if Orwell, on his deathbed, in terms of his literary aspirations and ideals, was actually reverting to type, going in circularity, going back to where he'd come from. So I don't think there would have been a 1984 part 2. I may be wrong about this. You never know how some publisher may have tempted him. Thank you very much, Sandra and Jeff. And now I think we've got about 20 minutes for some questions, if such there are. So do ask specific questions of specific people if you like, or ask general questions, and I'll hand the microphone round. It's quite up to you.
Thank you all very much. A terrific discussion. This is to add a tiny little footnote to Jeff's idea about the orientation of Orwell, extending him around the theme from the East. And this is an anecdote of the late 1980s in China, when China was opening up, but before 1989. And I was lucky enough to be invited to go give a talk at a Chinese university. They said, what are you going to talk about? And I wrote to my sponsor, saying, I'm very interested in George Orwell. At the moment, what I'm most excited by is Animal Farm. But I said, I recognise this might be a rather sensitive topic for a communist state. And I don't want to get you into trouble or to offend anyone in my audience. No, came the answer. We love Animal Farm in China. I said, well, really? Why is that? And the answer was, because it's about how the Russians betrayed the revolution.
No, I love that. I love that. Yeah.
That's a good one. Well, you never quite know how people are going to react to books, do you? This is the thing, and I think Orwell. In fact, I remember reading. There's a very, very funny piece. Must have been written sometime during the war, where he considers the Grossmith brothers, the Diary of Mr. Pooter. The archetypal comic figure, the late 19th century clerk oozing wounded amour propre. And Orwell makes the point that when it was translated into Russian, they thought it was like Chekhov. They thought it was a tragedy. Poor Mr. Pooter, this kind of. So these questions, these parallax views are always very interesting. Anybody else? Come on, I'm sure you. Gentleman there in the middle.
Hiya. So I work in a school, and I gave a copy of Julia to the head teacher. She liked it so much that she had it on her slide for her inset talk, which led me then to finish my copy. We had a bit of a discussion about what's going on at the end of the book. So I think about the best way to ask the question. As you maybe sometimes think about Julia, what happens in your mind to Julia after the book is finished?
What happens
to Julia after
What
the book
happens
is
to
finished?
Julia after the book is finished? All right. So, okay. So my intention with the end. This is funny since I've just read that bit from the 17th century Chinese writer, because I feel that recently I've tended to end my books with something where the world is doomed, but the character is going to be fine. And I suppose it does speak to who I think my audience is, because I feel that a lot of people who are reading books are people who think they will be fine. So I think Julia thinks she'll be fine. And that's really it. She really has, and she is a survivor, and there is a possibility that she will be fine absolutely no matter what happens. And I did base her to some degree on Russian women that I met when I was in Russia way back in the 1980s, like during the perestroika period. And you would meet these like elderly Russian women who were absolutely tough as nails and seemed, they had this cork-like quality to them, that they would just survive anything, and they had survived everything from the purges to what was then happening in the perestroika area. So but to specifically answer what happens to her after the novel, I don't know. So I think that what you're meant to think at the end is that she will be okay, but she probably doesn't deserve to be.
That wasn't what we discussed, actually.
You've nonplussed a reader there, which is always a good thing. There's one actually one of the things that I thought was particularly good about Julia was how you represented Winston and Julia's plight as kind of the byblow of a bureaucratic struggle between two different parts of the organisation, which I thought was entirely plausible, given what we know about totalitarian societies, which also reminded me of, I thought, a proverb, a warning that does, 1984 was very prescient about, which was that Orwell writes somewhere, I think it's in the review of the James Burnham and the Managerial Revolution, and he says, the world in the future is not going to be run by military men and politicians, it's going to be run by technocrats, which I thought was remarkably forward, far-sighted for 1946 or whatever he wrote. The gentleman there was going to ask something.
Thanks for a great talk. I was just wondering what you think Orwell's final warning is.
Yeah, I thought we were going to have to. Yeah, come on, Jeff, give us a steer here.
Well, I think he didn't have a single warning. This is no. The idea that 1984 doesn't have to be a prophecy. It depends what people do. So it's actually a kind of a recommitment to the Orwell who was involved in struggles of some sort and supporting struggles. So that would be one of the ways to think of it.
I suppose what I'd say is whenever people put their money down and say, okay, what's it all about? What message should we take away from Orwell? I usually refer to the brilliant essay he wrote about Charles Dickens, which I'm sure some of you know, where Orwell, this is written just before on the cusp of the Second World War, and Orwell goes through all the things that Dickens has been credited with, all the people who thought that he was a Marxist, all the people, G.K. Chesterton, who thought he was a Catholic, the people who thought he was a socialist. He goes through all of these things and throws them all out of the window and says that no, that's not it. And ultimately, Dickens's message could be summarised in 2 words. And the words are simply behave decently. And as Orwell says, either that's an enormous cliche, or it's the most important thing you can say to anybody about anything. And I suppose if he has a warning for me, it's the necessity for, collectively and singly to keep on behaving decently. If you can reduce it to if you can be reductive about those tens of, those millions of words, that's what's left for me at the end. Sandra.
Yeah, I'm afraid I just agree with David. I think that's actually a very good way of putting it. I think that Orwell, my deepest familiarity is with 1984, which I must have read 100 times, at least, some bits more. And, from contemplating that novel, what you get at the end is that he really believes that all ideas are suspect. And any time that you believe that you are right, regardless of whether you're a follower of Big Brother or whether you're Winston Smith, you should doubt yourself. But someone like Winston's mother, who just knows that she loves her children, is never wrong. So it's a bit sentimental when you look at it that way, as Dickens is. But I think that's what it is at the end of the day, and perhaps that's what a lot of fiction tells you at the end of the day.
I think you're right about the skepticism you defined there, because one of the best one-liners I think that anybody ever wrote about Orwell was his friend Sir Richard Rees, who wrote a book about him in the early 1960s, and it had the brilliant subtitle "Fugitive from the Camp of Victory," which I just thought was a brilliant description of Orwell's mind, and that the revolution succeeds, the battle is won, it's all great, but no, Orwell's picked up his tent and gone a couple of miles down the road because he knows that it isn't won. He knows that there's a worm in the bud. He knows there's a rotten apple in the barrel, and you have to start thinking about that. So I think that everything, all victories, all moral successes with Orwell are provisional, and in some ways that's part of his charm. The lack of any finite resolution, I think. More questions, please.
Yeah, just 2 questions. One for Jeff. I like what you mentioned about Hunger Game. The vision of Hunger Game replaced almost Orwell's vision, which is more scary because it's down to the most basic primitive scale of the fear and the control. And do you think that is what you think is a future vision, as David asked? And the second thing is for David. I thought it's really interesting when you mentioned this blacklist Orwell draw the communist members. Do you think that generally damaged Orwell's reputation, or that was just natural behavior during that time?
Shall I answer? I'll answer that question first, then pass to Jeff. Yeah. I think, as with all these things, and to a certain extent, the feminist onslaught, such it is, on aspects of Orwell's reputation. I think, and 1 or 2, after the Anna Funder book, 1 or 2 elderly American scholars wrote very piteous articles in intellectual American magazines saying, this was going to fundamentally undermine this great man. And I don't think it does, because I think Orwell is so big, he is so vast in the international firmament that only tiny amounts of this mud will stick, I think. That's my hope. As regards specifically the list, I think once the dust settled and the motives of some of the people making the criticism became apparent, I think Orwell managed to transcend this because, as I said, the political situation in the 1940s was so volatile and so. I remember for the first book, just before he died, I managed to interview Michael Foot, former leader of the Labour Party, left-wing Labour MP in the 1940s. And he said that if you were a Labour MP in 1945, you weren't so much worried about the Attlee government's agenda and all the wonderful things it was going to do. Your principal problem here in the Cold War was actually working out where your colleagues stood politically. And you would sit there on the Labour backbenches looking at all your colleagues, your supposed colleagues, and you think, Now, he's a left-winger. Is he a democratic left-winger, or is he actually secretly a member of the Communist Party? And so you spend all your time kind of calibrating and recalibrating your political, the opinions of your alleged colleagues, which is an extraordinary situation to be in. So I think, looking at it with the benefit of hindsight, I can't. I mean, Orwell himself, when he handed the list over to Celia Kerwin, said, not very sensational. And I think it's right. I don't think it was very sensational. Anyway, Hunger Games, Jeff. Enlighten us about the Hunger Games.
Yeah, about the Hunger Games. I guess what it is, one of the parts of it, and there's a connection between, so in Southeast Asia, the three-finger salute of resistance has become, which is used in the Hunger Games, becomes something that's used in protests in Thailand and in Burma. And in Hong Kong, the phrase, if we burn, you burn with us, which was from the Hunger Games too, a kind of last-ditch effort. But it goes along, it's about a youthful rebellion. It's a kind of David versus Goliath story for a new generation. And there are elements of Harry Potter that fit into that as well, with young people standing up against the all-powerful. And in Thailand, all of these came together in an interesting way. There was a coup in 2014, and before the coup, there still was a very limited certain kinds of freedoms. And student groups were organizing cultural events where they would do something that didn't directly challenge the establishment, but had a subversive side to it, like showing films like 1984. When the junta took power in a coup, they shut down showings of 1984 because it was so on the nose. And there was a ban on gatherings of more than a certain number of people. And what the students did was they organized gatherings of one less than the people you were allowed to do, and each would show up holding a copy of 1984. And the junta said, they knew what that was about. But one of the movies, The Hunger Games, was playing, and the junta didn't know enough about youth culture to know that it had the same implications. So some of the students organized, well, now let's gather at that showing and go around it. And then they started using the three-finger salute, and then the junta made that salute illegal. So I think along with, there are myths, there are books, there are symbolic things that explain to you what's wrong with the world. And I think 1984 talks about all kinds of things that are wrong. There are others that are models of what you do or of a possible of rebellion and of amazing things happening against all odds. So you have David and Goliath, and you have something like the Hunger Games, and you have V for Vendetta. You have different things that then get appropriated and used in the world of that. What amazes me about the three-finger salute, though, is there's a very smart analyst of popular culture and digital culture, Anxiao Mina, and she said this might take off all over the place. Because think how great it is in any dangerous place. You go to the march and you've got it with you. If people come, you hide it, you stick it in your pocket. The Black Power salute was her other kind of analogy, and victory. All of those hand gestures went global. It's very interesting that the Hunger Games, well, maybe in 50 years there'll be Hunger Games symposium.
Any more? Yes, gentleman there, Richard.
Yeah, just wanted to ask you, we say that the appendix gives a hopeful kind of feel to 1984, and looking back, and maybe it's all gone past. I don't think completely convinced on that. You probably also know that, and there's two explanations for this. In the second impression of 1984, the famous equation 2 + 2 equal blank space, not 5, and that error was repeated quite a long time in the Second Warfare printings, and some people have said, well, maybe Orwell was a bit more kind of optimistic, because 2 + 2 equals question mark is more optimistic than 2 + 2 equals 5. So I wanted to see what you think. Convince us really that there is an optimistic ending to 1984, and if you could comment on your view on the 2 + 2 equals side. Because it could just be a typing error.
It could, and I've read Peter Davison's essay about it numberless times and never really come to a conclusion. And I agree with you. The straws we're clutching at in that appendix about Newsweek are very, very frail ones. But I don't think you can altogether discount them, because it does seem to me to be a historical document, one which is written with what purports to be objectivity, but by somebody who sounds quite authoritative in the future. So obviously the political situation has changed. We don't know how it's changed, but it's obviously changed in some way. And I suppose, to me, it's a chink. It's a chink of light. I mean, I don't know. I mean, this is a terrible confession, I suppose, but I would have to say that 1984 is not my favourite Orwell novel. I actually like the 30s ones. They're kind of seem to me to be more realised in a way, and I still think that although it took Orwell, one of the interesting things about 1984 is how long it took him to finish. Orwell was a quick worker. He wrote books in a year, 9 months. 1984 took him 5 years from start to finish, and a lot of this was to do with his health. A lot of it was to do with the fact that he was still formulating intellectual positions along the way for a lot of things he wrote about, and you can see, you can actually track the process of his thought through the essays that he's writing in magazines while he's doing it. But I still think that had he lived longer, it would have been a slightly different book, possibly a better book. I don't know, that's just me. But what do you think? Tell us what you think about the 2 + 2 =.
Oh, I can't figure that one out. Yeah. But it resonates. I think it resonates with, it resonates again with this kind of Orwellian, not just about surveillance, but about trying to get inside of people's heads through, and I think actually it's probably one of the things that people who've lived within in a system that aspires for that kind of control think about a lot. The forced confession, the saying things that you don't believe, but having to convince people that you believe them. And I think that might be one of the things when we become so used to surveillance that we don't think about that we might think more about that side to it.
Thank you. I think we've got time for one more question. There was a lady there who was anxiously putting her hand up. Thank you.
Two of you mentioned the feminist critique of 1984, which I'm not aware of, to my shame. But how would you sum it up? What's the feminist critique?
Well, in a nutshell, I suppose I would say that, I don't think I'm traducing her to say that Anna Funder's book, they're very respectful of large amounts that Orwell wrote, and she declares she's a fan, isn't she? I mean, she is. But she convicts him of being cruel to his wife, of neglecting her, of not being there when she died, of borrowing her, plagiarising his wife, of being misogynistic, of being uncaring, and catalogue of horrors. Basically, that is the feminist argument against. And as I say, approaching this from the biographer's angle, it's just to give you one example of where I would take issue with some of it, is that it now seems to be, and I read half a dozen reviews of the Funder which seemed to accept it as fact that Orwell had plagiarised a poem that Eileen wrote for her own school magazine in the early 1930s, where the word 1984 appears, and it's about the steel, the machine future, and so forth, and it is 1984 appears in the title, and this is apparently proof that Orwell plagiarised his wife's writing. Now, quite apart from the fact that there is no proof that Orwell ever saw that, because it was written, before they met. If you look at the original title of 1984 was actually The Last Man in Europe, and it stayed The Last Man in Europe until very late on in the process. And if you look at the original manuscript of 1984, it wasn't actually set in 1984 for a very long time. In fact, the original writing, where he first gives a date, you can see he's written 1980. And then a little bit later, a pencil mark has gone through the O, and he's changed it to 1982. And then quite a long way after that, the 2 is slightly erased, and a 4 has been. So the idea of calling it 1980, setting it in 1984, came quite late on in the process. And it seems to me, as I say, trying to weigh the evidence as objective as one can, that he can't have seen, or even if he did, he's not consciously plagiarising his wife because he hasn't made up his mind about the date. I don't know, what do you think, Sarah?
So I think Well, on the question of him plagiarizing his wife, I think it's a bit, people love to make that argument, and I think it's a bit silly generally. And I would say that one of the things that Anna Funder was very serious about was arguing that that Eileen had done a lot of editing on Animal Farm, and it was as much her work as his. And I think, like, my husband edits everything that I do, and if you know, people are free to say that it was all his work after I've died. It's not really the case. But as far as 1984 specifically is concerned, you know, as somebody who's written a book that was sold as a sort of a feminist retelling of 1984, I meet a lot of women who have huge difficulty reading that book because it has a lot of misogyny in it. And it seems that most of it is intentional on the part of Orwell, and he's trying to talk about how, like, denying intimacy to men in totalitarian regimes inspires this kind of hatred and misogyny and distrust. And he has, you know, when Winston first is encountering, it's not the first time he's ever seen her, but the first scene that they have together, he fantasizes about raping and killing her. He fantasizes about killing her 3 different ways. In fact, I think shooting her full of arrows, like Saint Sebastian, is one of them. And later he again fantasizes about killing her when he thinks that she's spying on him. And all of that, it's so heartfelt. You know, it's the writing of someone who's had those feelings. But we do all have some of the ugliest feelings that, perhaps we all have all of the ugliest feelings that are possible for a human being to have at some point in our lives. On the other hand, you can see 1984, like in 1984, Orwell clearly attributes a lot of feminist postures, feminist attitudes to the state of Big Brother. And, you know, things like women not being allowed to wear pretty frocks or to put on makeup. And the fact that when Julia becomes liberated, the thing that she most wants to do is put on pretty frocks and prance around for Winston and make him cups of tea. It's not always welcome to female readers. And they do not experience that as a liberation. And it makes it hard to feel the book in the way that you're meant to feel it for a lot of female readers. And especially, I think, like, my own experience of it was that the first time I read it, I must have been 14, and I had no trouble with it, and I just read it as Winston. You know, you read it through the point of view of the protagonist, and I had no trouble with that. But when I read it again, when I was, like, a 19-year-old angry feminist, I had huge problems with it. And so
I think I read it like you did at 14 when I was probably about 50, where you are Winston, and you don't, yeah, enough time's passed for. If I reread it now, I'm sure I'd see it differently.
yeah, but it's interesting. Like it does go to the question of what do you require from a writer, and I think now that I'm not 19, I don't require a writer to see things the way I do, and I can hate some of the things that they think, and it doesn't really trouble me nearly as much as it used to.
Thank you. Jeff, to conclude.
So I think one of the things about the frustration with Orwell late in life still having some of these, and it's also about tendencies toward misogyny in his relationships that is talked about, is that one of the key things about his writing up to that point was him re-examining prejudices that he had and rethinking them. And he talks in his things about the working class, about feeling revulsion and then trying to work through that. And there's a book about Orwell and Jura that came out, in all of the Orwell's Island, I think it's called, or something like that. And it in that talks about how he had this hatred of Scottish people. He had this real prejudice against Scots. And this actually also goes back to Burma. It all goes back to Asia, which was, the argument was that in Burma, a lot of the most kind of bullying colonial figures he encountered were Scottish. And then late in life, he goes to Jura to spend time there and things, and he gets to like some Scottish people, and he starts thinking, well, wait a minute, actually, Scotland has been colonized. So if you had been colonized, and then you're in a period where you get to be the colonial figure. And so I think there's one way in which maybe this is projecting forward. One of the ways to think about a kind of feminist discussions of Orwell might come back to that. If he had lived longer, would he or would he have not re-examined that. And in Orwell's Ghost, another recent book, Laura Beers, she has a chapter on patriarchy in his writings, and that I think is something that wrestles with these questions, and I'm not score settling, but just trying to figure it out.
I mean, he does revise. One of the great things about him is he revises his opinions about things. I mean, he was accused of anti-Semitism by one of his many Jewish friends in the 1940s, went away and thought about it, and then conspicuously tried to make amends by writing articles for Jewish newspapers. And in fact, the original manuscript of 1984, there are a couple of remarks in it which might possibly be construed as anti-Jew, and Orwell goes through and takes them out because he doesn't want them to appear in the final version. Now, you may argue that that's not much of an act of reparation, but it's something. And there are some writers who wouldn't take that step. Who would just stick to deeply entrenched positions. I think we have to stop because it's 8:15. You've been a wonderful audience. Thank you very much for your questions. And there are books to be purchased, I believe. Thank you very much.